of romantic love and other essays. She is also the author of several scholarly articles, reviews, and book chapters. So welcome, Dr. Shaw.
Thank you so much. Many thanks to Stephanie Garrett for all her great work here in student life and elsewhere in the library and throughout our common work at CDU. It's really a blessing to have you with us. And it's wonderful to be with everyone here tonight, all of you. Just before I get started, full disclosure, much of my presentation, my remarks this evening, much of this was originally prepared as a scholarly article. So I beg your pardon if I veer off and become a bit too technical. I've really tried to be intentional to avoid that in my preparation for tonight, but you may notice that a bit. And if you're interested in full, properly prepared remarks, I'm happy to share those with you too after we finish up. So to begin, a basic overview of what I intend to do this evening. My presentation will be in three parts. I begin with a very brief biographical sketch of Dietrich von Hildebrand, and then I'll move into a quick introduction to the basic meaning of personalism as part of the philosophical enterprise in general. And then I'll move on to the third part, which is an exposition of Hildebrand's basic claim that it's the heart, what he calls the heart, not intellect or will, that is the true center of the person. So there's kind of a logical progression there. And the majority of my remarks will be in that third part of the presentation. So next slide. I'll begin with the biographical sketch. And for this part of what I'm going to say, I really must give due credit to an organization that's called the Hildebrand Project. You can Google them, Hildebrand Project. I believe the website is simply hildebrandproject.org, but Google will take you there as needed. And instead of reinventing the wheel, I've more or less copied and pasted the nice, succinct biographical sketch that can be found there. So Dietrich von Hildebrand's dates are 1889 to 1977. So he's a thinker fairly close to our time. Many of us were alive at the same time he was for some years, for a few years at least. He was born in Florence, Italy, and was the son of a well-known German sculptor, Adolf von Hildebrand. Dietrich studied closely the work of 20th century philosophers Edmund Husserl and Max Scheler, and in his own work was very much engaged with the classical perennial issues that we see cropping up again and again in philosophical discourse, namely things like truth, freedom, conscience, community, love, and beauty. Hildebrand was an original thinker in a variety of philosophical subdisciplines, including ethics, epistemology, social philosophy, and aesthetics. He converted to Catholicism in 1914, and that was really a pivotal point in his life at which he began to take up religious themes in his writing. His very public opposition to Hitler and Nazism was so outspoken that he was forced to flee Germany in 1933. He moved across Europe and eventually migrated to the US and settled in New York City in 1940, where he taught at Fordham University until 1960. Hildebrand wrote dozens of books and was a major thinker in the Catholic landscape leading up to Vatican II. He penned important works on marriage, liturgy, Christian philosophy, and other timely themes. So he's really an interesting and I say quite important figure for a number of reasons, not least being the breadth of his thought and engagement with important ideas. So we can move to our next slide. Thank you. So next, second part, let me offer a very quick introduction to this idea of personalism. So basic question, what is Christian personalism? In order to answer that question, I think it's best to begin by distinguishing what we typically call philosophical anthropology, aka the philosophy of human nature, from what we're doing here when we're doing personalism. So start with philosophical anthropology, or otherwise known as philosophy of human nature. It's probably not unfamiliar to many of you. When we're doing a philosophical anthropology, what we're seeking to do is answer the basic question, what is man? Or what is human nature, right? And we know that in the history of philosophy, there are generally three major approaches to answering that key question. What is human nature? What is man? Really simplistically, there's one option is what we call a reductive materialist position, the reductive materialism. And that is, just as it sounds, we are nothing but our bodies, our physical nature, our material stuff. That's it. Okay. When you're dead, you're done. This is you can see it, poke it, touch it. That's what we are. We are bodies, physical stuff, material stuff. Nothing lives on after we're dead. Okay. Reductive materialism. Second option, which I think most of us would agree is kind of a step forward, is what we might call dualism. Instead of reducing us to that one thing, the body, the dualist perspective says, well, no, we've got kind of two key things going on here. We've got two principles in play, an immaterial and a material. Okay, so we are bodies, but somehow combined with our bodies, we're a soul or mind or some immaterial thing. Okay, so we've got these two principles that are somehow joined together for a time. And death means the separation of these two. And typically, under this kind of an account, we say that what lives on is the immaterial principle. And indeed, that's really the more fundamental reality when we're trying to offer an account of human nature. What I truly am is that immaterial principle, not the body that's just around for a time and eventually dies and disintegrates, ashes to ashes and all that. So that's a second approach to accounting for human nature. And then the third approach, I'll go ahead and affirm is yet another step forward, is what we call the hylomorphic view, hylomorphism. This was originally articulated by Aristotle, eventually affirmed by the church as more or less the correct account of what we are, what our human nature is. And here what we're saying is we're not a duality, a dualism, this sort of temporary combination of body and soul, but really a fundamental unity of body and soul. Right? Soul is the form of the body. Okay? The form of the body. There's a lot of Aristotelian terminology embedded in that statement that would take a bit of time to work out, but we get the basic idea. Fundamental unity. The soul is the animating principle that orders the body and makes us capable of performing all of our characteristic activities as human beings. So it's not this plus this, but it's these two things together in a unity. One doesn't really make sense without the other. You can't really think soul without thinking body, and vice versa. So those are the three basic accounts of human nature: the reductive materialism, dualism, and then the hylomorphic view, where we have the unity of body and soul. So notice this, those questions that philosophical anthropology seeks to answer. What is human nature? What is man? These are indeed extremely important questions. For our answers to them will have lots of broader implications or consequences in ethics, in politics, and elsewhere. Important questions. But notice that in answering them, I gave the three accounts, what we're getting at in that answer is real simply what is common to all of us. What is the same across all human beings? Okay, so what we're going for here when we're doing a philosophical anthropology is seeking a single account, the single account that holds for each instance of that human nature. Okay, so we're kind of looking for what's the same across all of us, what unites us as a species. Now, when we're talking about the person and personalism, we're talking about something very different. Okay, so I'm setting up a contrast here. Against that backdrop of human nature or anthropology, now we're going to talk about the person, personalism. So the really important basic idea could be expressed this way. Personalism as a philosophical enterprise, or as part of the philosophical enterprise, makes thematic not man in general or human nature, but the person. Using this term in a really technical and precise way. Another way of expressing the distinction is to say we're not trying to ferret out what I am or what you are, but who I am or who you are. So we're really intentionally shifting the language here, changing the pronouns, right? Using these words person and who are intentionally, we're intending to signal this important precision and distinction in the reality that we're trying to get at through personalism, as opposed to philosophical anthropology. So while I would never deny that we do, as human beings, share a common nature, I want to make the distinction that when we're talking about personalism, we're going beyond that. By contrast, what we're seeking really is to understand how, as persons, we are truly, each of us, uncommon, unique, unrepeatable. So nature is common. As persons, we're uncommon. That's the sort of the simplest way of expressing the distinction here. And for the record, we find this approach, this personalist approach, not just in Hildebrand, but also in well-known thinkers such as St. John Paul II, several other Christian thinkers, including Jacques Maritain and Gabriel Marcel, names you may be familiar with, and many others, all of whom share this commitment to the idea that there is something genuine, deeper, ineffable, and indeed mysterious about the person. And yet it is precisely as persons that we are most deeply in communion with others and with God. So there's something of a paradox in play here. If you're picking up on that, that's exactly right. But I wish to displace that paradox for now. We could go to the next slide, please. So the next thing that I want to examine is Hildebrand's personalism. What does personalism look like in the thought of Dietrich von Hildebrand? How does he develop this idea, this approach? And admittedly, I can give you only a very small taste in this evening's session. But I think a very good place to begin in trying to unpack Hildebrand's personalism is to begin with this simple idea, actually a very big claim, that it's the heart. And by that, we do not mean that the bodily organ that pumps blood, in the middle of the chest, but the heart meaning to say our affective center or our affectivity, that dimension of our being. This thing, the heart, Hildebrand says, is the true self, the true center of the person. So unpacking this idea that the heart is the true self, the heart is the true center of the person, this will introduce us to some key ideas in Hildebrand's thought more broadly, and give us a good sense of what he's up to as a philosopher. So let's back up for a minute. Most thinkers in the classical Aristotelian Thomistic tradition that many of you, I would assume, are pretty well familiar with, this tradition is generally favored in Catholic circles, right? Most thinkers in this tradition give priority to two other things, intellect and will, more specifically free will. These two things in their accounts of human nature. And for sure, that's done not without good reason. By intellect, we come to know or have approached the truth of the world. And free will is crucial for our pursuit of the good, and thereby our life as moral beings. Right? Intellect and will are central to our fulfillment as human beings. Okay? They are the great gifts through which we engage in our highest activities and move toward our perfection. Even so, in Hildebrand's view, to ignore this third thing, the heart, affectivity, is a grave error. So he spends a lot of time on this theme of the heart. So Hildebrand maintains that the heart is, alongside intellect and will, an equally important element of an account of both what we are and who we are. That is to say, both our common human nature, but also the reality, the uncommon reality of each of us as a person. So the heart is a third thing, not reducible to intellect or will. This thing, the heart, sits alongside those other two and functions in its own distinctive ways. So for Hildebrand, in the well-formed person, all three elements are integrated and cooperative. Moreover, neither intellect nor will, but rather the heart is, as I said, the true center of the person. That's the big claim. More than anything else, the heart, according to Hildebrand, is essential to our being. It accounts for both our distinctiveness as a species and, even more pointedly, the uniqueness, the distinctiveness of each of us as an unrepeatable person. And thus we have the key point from Hildebrand that I want to develop tonight, namely his assertion that the heart is the real self. So we can begin to unpack that idea by clarifying exactly how the heart functions in our human experience. So we can move to the next slide, please. So how does the heart function in our human experience? Hildebrand begins by noting the need very clearly to distinguish our subjective feelings from genuine affectivity. Okay, often those two things are conflated, and affectivity gets a bad name because it's thought of as nothing more than my subjective feelings. And that's a misconstrual of what Hildebrand means by genuine affectivity. Okay. It's a major error to conflate these two things. Okay. This misunderstanding entails the key failure to grasp that the true objective nature of affective experiences, such as joy, love, and enthusiasm, always derives from something outside of us. So as a corrective to this tendency to conflate the two, subjective feelings and genuine affectivity, Hildebrand clarifies that, again, affectivity properly understood is precisely what he calls, and this is a really key term, key idea in his broader philosophy. Affectivity properly understood is precisely a response to the value or disvalue of some object in our human experience, something outside of us, something objective that we encounter in our experience. Okay? So our affectivity is a response to that value outside of us that we encounter. So in other words, really, really important to grasp that the activity of the heart, or affectivity, is never a free-floating inward feeling or state of consciousness untethered from an object. Rather, it's always bound up with some object of value that I encounter out there in the world. That could be a moving act of kindness or generosity that I witness, a stirring musical piece that I hear, a beautiful sunset that I see. Okay, these sorts of things outside of me that I encounter in my experience. So to grasp the heart properly, Hildebrand maintains, one must also appreciate its spiritual role and the place equal in rank to that of the will and the intellect that it holds. That was a quotation from him. For evidence, he says, we have to look at man's life, just observe, right? At his quest for earthly happiness, at his religious life, at the lives of the saints, at the gospel and the liturgy. Again, I'm quoting from Hildebrand. In each of these areas, the heart is engaged, arguably even more so than intellect or will. Indeed, the actualization of the heart, the responsiveness of the heart in those experiences, not the mind or intellect, not the will, it is the goal, is the whole point of these noblest, highest human things: happiness, religious experience, joy, love, enthusiasm. Okay, these most profound elements of our human experiences. Profound love and joy, indeed, are the paradigmatic affective responses in the Christian context. Or at least this is Hildebrand's line. I don't think it's too hard to follow him here. And think about it for a second. Profound love and joy, these are things that we don't really think our way into experiencing, or even will our way into experiencing. Hildebrand writes, on a quote, "Who will deny that Christian revelation has granted to love a supreme and central role, and that it has clearly expounded the nature of love in its full affectivity and as the voice of the heart?" He quotes the words of St. Paul, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice." So the point being that while intellect and will may be certainly involved as preparatory for these highest experiences, profound love and joy, neither one of those things, love nor joy, is, at the very moment they are experienced, a function of intellect or will. So a really important thing to notice is that affectivity in no way detracts from, but is in fact the key to our genuine objectivity. And that those who would deny or otherwise suppress it commit the gravest sins against objective reality. So it's a real realism in play here. As Hildebrand explains, the truly affective man, the man with an awakened heart, it's a really important idea for having an awakened heart. That person is precisely the one who grasps that what matters is the objective situation and whether there is reason to rejoice and to be happy. Furthermore, only such a person supplies the full affective response for which the objective situation calls. This doesn't always happen. Think about people, in your own life and maybe your own self. Right? Anyone who fails to respond adequately to the values and the disvalues that are out there in the world that we encounter, whether owing to a hardened heart, that happens, or to a commitment to so-called neutrality, that sort of a person suffers from what Hildebrand and others would diagnose as some form of spiritual pathology. I might call it willful disaffection. You're familiar with the term willful ignorance. This is kind of the analog in the area of affectivity. And somebody who has that kind of spiritual pathology is clearly not at all objective, not responding to the value out there in the world that calls for a certain response. So we might think, for example, our response to or reckoning with the full meaning of and significance of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. You can't get any bigger than that. Right? That is, our response, our contemplation of an affective response to Christ's sacrifice on the cross is fundamentally an affective experience, an awakening of the heart. If we think in terms of this, our response to Christ's sacrifice on the cross, if we think in terms of that as sort of the paradigmatic test case, and there are certainly other lesser awakenings of the heart, responses of the heart. And I think we do begin to grasp what Hildebrand's getting at here. So I just offer that to you as something for meditation, maybe. But just to go back and collect thoughts, the heart's activity is crucial for the perfection of the person. That's Hildebrand's hard line. We must have an active, keen, aware, awakened heart in order to be perfected as human beings, as persons, indeed. For an awakened heart is what informs both our will and our intellect. I'm going to offer another quote from Hildebrand. He explains, "A man must first see the splendor and glory of the cosmos. Just take it all in. Its mysteries, as well as its tragic features, its character as a valley of tears. Value perception," that's what we're talking about here, "is the indispensable presupposition for the penetration of a man's soul by the ray of values and for the fecundation of his mind." So we need to have this affective encounter with and taking in of the greatness, the grandeur of reality, creation, okay, before we can start thinking down the right tracks. So both the moral life and the intellectual life depend on a person's affective acuity, we might say. It's something we can, we have a natural aptitude for it. but it's also something we can train in or get better at. And truly realizing one's full human potential requires a cultivated, open, and active heart. Hildebrand says, a person can increase and develop all the spiritual wealth and depth to which he is called only if he is imbued with the values he perceives, only if we're ready to take it all in, only if his heart is moved and kindled by these values and burns in responses of joy, enthusiasm, and love. Next slide, please. So you're probably getting the picture, right? Intellect, will, really important things and truly distinctive elements of human nature. But the heart, at least in Hildebrand's presentation here, the heart is the most intimate part of the person. And this is especially apparent when one examines the important human phenomena of love and happiness. In all of its forms, genuine love is constituted by an active heart, right? The heart of the one who loves reaches out, extends itself, and seeks union with the heart of the beloved. It is filled to the brim with longing, and when united with the beloved, joyful. As Hildebrand describes it, the heart is here not only the true self, because love is essentially a voice of the heart, it is also the true self insofar as love aims at the heart of the beloved in a specific way. So here we're talking about that idea of communion that I briefly mentioned earlier. The lover wants to pour his heart into the beloved. He wants to affect the beloved's heart, to fill it with happiness. And of course, right, common sense, you don't need to be on this planet for too long to recognize that will alone is inadequate for love. Will won't get us there. A person may will and indeed act for the sake of our good, but only go that far. Okay? I can will your good, but not love you, right? So will itself has, it can be exercised, but still not execute. We can still fail to execute love. Hildebrand writes, as long as we feel that the benefits he bestows on us, his considerations and his sacrifices are dictated only by a good and generous will, we know that we do not really possess the beloved because we do not possess his heart. Think of cases of unrequited love. A person can be very nice to us, but if they're not really loving us in return, there's something missing here. The heart is also, according to Hildebrand, the key element in the experience of happiness. Right? For it's obvious, again, we can't will ourselves into love, or will can go only so far. It's also obvious that we can't will or think ourselves into being happy. If we only will to be happy, Hildebrand notes, or if a person realizes only with his intellect that objectively he must consider himself happy, I check all the boxes, I've got a house and a family and a dog and a job and all health and all those things that are supposed to be making me happy. I can intellectually go through that checklist and still be unhappy, right? The point being that intellect alone doesn't make us happy, right? Will alone doesn't make us happy. We can't will ourselves into happiness. So it is fair at least to say that the activities of intellect and will may be a part of happiness insofar as they are preparatory or necessary as prerequisites. We need to think and act well in order to get to happiness. It's still also painfully true that something more than either of those two things is needed to close the deal, to actually get us to happiness. So Hildebrand affirms the significance of free will as indeed one of the deepest marks of the person, and a feature in which man's character as an image of God manifests itself. At the same time, however, freedom, our freedom, is not what determines that an activity or an object is of the highest rank. If it flows from free will, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the highest sort of thing out there. Indeed, the very highest things, Hildebrand points out, are not the things that we freely will or make, but rather those things that we receive, that we're receptive to. The highest things are indeed gifts, supernatural grace, right? That's the example par excellence. Grace is never something we obtain by free willing it ourselves, making it ourselves, right? Indeed, it's an absolute unmerited gift, utterly inaccessible to our own freedom. We don't get there on our own steam. It's a gift from God. The same is true among natural goods, descend from the supernatural down to the natural order. Our genius, our artistic and other talents, our very existence. We don't will these things or give these things to ourselves. We don't create them for ourselves or gain them somehow through our own free efforts. They're gifts. Highest of all, our happiness, our blessedness, right? It's exactly like this. Happiness is a gift, pure gift, says Hildebrand. Much as we may prepare the ground for it through our own efforts, our will and intellect, genuine happiness remains a gift, dropping like dew upon our heart, shining gratuitously like a sun ray into our soul. Quotations. Another really important, larger point is that our very heart itself, our affectivity, is a gift as well. The values we encounter in the world are things we receive, and in turn, things to which we respond. Hildebrand gives examples and explains that, for example, deep contrition, the gift of tears, the deep and ardent love, being moved on hearing sublime music, or when witnessing an act of superabundant charity. These experiences exist in the higher spiritual part of the affective realm and have the character of gifts from above. Just as analogously, deep insight, intellectual insight is a gift. So it's not the will, but the heart that is the proper spiritual organ, we might say, for experiencing, for receiving these greatest gifts. The next slide, please. I'm getting to my conclusion. In summary, Hildebrand writes that man is greater and deeper than the range of things he can control with his free will. His being reaches into the mysterious depths which go far beyond what he can engender or create. The highest way that we can exercise our free will, moreover, is precisely in service of the heart. True freedom is cooperative in this sense. In the sense precisely that it facilitates our affectivity. The will is functioning at its very best when it opens us up. We open ourselves up to receive and adequately respond to the values that are out there in reality, accessible to us through our experience. In the sanctioning, in the yes of our free spiritual center, which forms from within our being affected by values, and above all, our affective responses to them. Primarily, most importantly, our will opens us up to respond to God and to what Hildebrand will call morally relevant values. But this openness of our heart also includes our receptivity to other forms of love and aesthetic experience. The overall goal is a keen heart, an awakened heart, fully alive and responsive to values wherever they are out there and encountered in the world. And herein lies the great mystery and distinctiveness of the human person, what's uncommon about each of us. Hildebrand writes, it is in the affective sphere, in the heart, that the treasures of man's most individual life are stored. It is in the heart that the secret of the person is to be found. It is here that the most intimate word is spoken. So, last sentence, irreducible to intellect and will, and more than either of these, the heart is the true center of the human person. And as such, its significance is something we fail to grasp at our own peril. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. That was very interesting. And we will now open up for questions. So you can either raise your hand or just turn on your mic. Okay, Deacon Serge?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Shaw. I really appreciate your presentation. It was really wonderful. I remember you from my philosophy class, and when you were Athens and you were dwelling with Dr. Wood about Occam, and I'm in moral theology now. We're deep into Occam, and how that's affected our whole ethical system with obligation and all of that. I really, I'm so glad I came to your presentation here. So the heart, so for a long time, and I've shifted from that after I came to this program. For a long time, I always thought about, and there's a verse I'm trying to find here. The Apostle Paul is talking about the body, mind, and spirit. So for a long time, I always thought about our composition being three, like a triune. Body, mind, and spirit. Mm-hmm. And then I had to kind of get away from that thought because of their Aristotelian and Thomistic thought of what we are as body, soul, whole, which you mentioned. But then your presentation here kind of brings me back to that, the heart basically being the triunity of the person in the sense that we're body, mind, and spirit, and the heart perhaps being the conscience, even where we talk about the conscience and having a formed conscience. So as you're presenting these things, those are the kind of thoughts that are going into my mind. I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but I'm trying to reconcile these things based on the idea of the heart.
Yeah, I think it's really excellent to bring that triad of body, mind, and spirit into the mix here. You know, is this exactly the same overlay that we're doing? I think it's probably a bit different because actually, if you know, in Hildebrand's account, if we're parsing it out, we've really got four things, right? Body, intellect, mind. Spirit, if you want to say spirit, is, you know, the analog of heart, but then where's will, right? So, but yes, so this is just an illustration of how we're always fraught when we try to take one system and overlay it with another. It's a very good intellectual exercise because it helps us to understand both sides better. But it doesn't always quite work, right? So I'm grateful to you for introducing that. I would also say that that's a really intriguing point that you make about conscience, right? And conscience in the I think it would be fair to say in the sort of classical Aristotelian Thomistic line, conscience is a blend of, obviously we've got the principles right. We've got the intellect lined up properly. We know what's right and we know what's wrong. We know how to distinguish those two things in a very general way. But conscience sort of presumes that background component, that intellectual component. But even more so, it's distinguished through the element of desire, perfected desires, right? We not only know what is right, but we also have at least some inkling of desire for what is right, right? And that's the difference between vice and incontinence and continence, and as we're sliding up the scale toward virtue, where we have truly perfected desires, right, and the best conscience in play there. So really interesting to think through these things on that scale too. Conscience and heart, how would we fit those ideas together? Definitely worth going down that track. But go ahead and respond.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say thank you, Deacon Serge. I don't feel so alone now, because my mind was traveling to Augustine's mind, body, soul connection also. So that is good.
And of course, the heart is very important for Augustine too, right?
Yeah. So, unless Deacon Serge has a response to your response, Maritza has her hand up as well.
Thank you. I also was thinking of the same body, mind, soul, and the connection with spirit. But now this concept of heart is really open up to something very interesting, something new for me. Mm-hmm. So what book do you recommend to start reading Hildebrand?
A couple. Great question.
Because I'm not so good on philosophy, but I would like to try, because it's a really concept.
For those who have a theological bent, like yourselves and everybody here, I think Hildebrand is a very comfortable thinker to dive into. So I think you go well with it. I would say recommendations. Start with the smaller books. He's written some very long, big books.
Yes, I see here that he has chapbooks.
Chapbooks are great. Yeah, nice little slim ones on often collections of essays on a discrete theme. But I would recommend two, just if you're interested in what I talked about. That one is simply called The Heart. Okay. And the other is called The Art of Living. The Art of Living, which is another small book. And in it, we get a survey of a variety of really important, what we call attitudes or dispositions to cultivate, right? These are features of a well-formed heart, we might even say, right? First of those is a reverence. Right? Hildebrand has this very high regard for reverence. He says, reverence is the mother of the moral life. And I think this is a wonderful idea to unpack. So I'll leave it at that. Art of Living and The Heart, two great places.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Ken Stackpole has the next question. You can unmute, Ken. See if I can unmute you. Okay. So he put it in the chat. He said, it's very interesting that love, joy are the heart's reaction to a situation. Rather than giving love, we are receiving love. Interesting. I have felt that way, but never thought of it that way. If I'm understanding what you said correctly, thinking further, I agree. We can feel the love we receive, but not give.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is exactly Hildebrand's wavelength. And it really fits in with the basic picture of creation, right? Just start with the fundamental reality that God didn't have to make any of this, and God would have been perfectly complete and whole. And, you know, the fact of creation doesn't add one iota of goodness, doesn't supplement God's goodness in any way. He's fully perfect, regardless of the act of creation or not. You know, it's a counterfactual. Creation happened, but even if it hadn't happened, God would still retain his full perfection. So what we're saying here, we reflect on that reality. There is the pure, absolute gratuity of God's creative act. It didn't have to happen, but it did, right? And everything else follows, and we are just beneficiaries, right? So that's the really big picture in which this analysis of the heart fits. So yeah, Ken, I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
He said it gives him goosebumps thinking of it this way. And thank you. And as Serge, I remember, you know, we remember Serge from philosophy class. So that's good. See, we all get to connect some more. I find this really interesting because I'm such a pragmatist at heart. And so when I first started studying philosophy, it was I was like, I don't want to think, I want to, you know, no. But I think too of our current situation in our modern culture where people strive to procure stuff, to be perfect, and all of this thinking that it will bring them happiness, and it doesn't. And that whole thing that it's the difference between gift and receptivity and procurement
mm-hmm.
to find happiness is so at odds with what most people think these days.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can't understand why they're not happy.
Absolutely, because it's a fool's errand, right? We can't,
right.
We can't get it.
Right.
For sure.
So that's what really came to mind after, you know, my thinking 3 parts: mind, body, soul. Let's talk Augustine. But no, I just that whole difference between being receptive, that affective heart,
mm-hmm.
to be receptive rather than to just think you have to use your will to force and your intellect to force and get things.
Absolutely. I'm glad we're all on the same page.
Yay. Well, it's 7:29. So does anybody have a last question or comment? Okay. All right. Then I'm going to go over here and look at what's on my slides to remind everybody of. Okay, so we want to thank Dr. Shaw for joining us tonight. And
thank you.
Then we hope to see you for some upcoming Student Life Office Hour events. Next Monday, we're going to have a special bilingual event that is specifically geared for the students in the AACST program to help make sure they are comfortable with conducting library research and organizing their paper. And then on Tuesday, December 5th, for those of you who haven't picked out your spring classes, Dr. Weena Isabel Gollum will join us in Pronto to answer advising questions for the Spring 1 term that begins on January 8th, 2024. Please remember that as you exit, a short survey opens, and if you will take that or fill that out, all your responses are anonymous. And for more information on student life events, let me see if I can, I was going to try to copy them into the chat, but you can go to Student Life, the Student Life page in Canvas, or just check us out in Pronto. So thank you and good night.
Thanks, everybody. God bless.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Good night. Thanks, Dr. Shaw.